Out of the current economic crisis, it's arguable that a new capitalism will be born. This is not any old turn in the economy. These towering glass palaces in the City of London were built during the boom years. Bankers got rich, tax revenues flowed to the exchequer, the economy prospered. But also created here were many of the causes of the economic mess we're in. History of the wrong sort has been made in the City and Wall Street.
The big problem this time, and it has happened before, but it's a relative rarity, is quite simple. The banks went bust before the economic downturn. So we're riding into the mother of all recessions with the banking sector, which is already on its knees.
The trigger of the banking crisis was all those repossessions and losses from crazy subprime lending in the US. But the fundamental cause was that in America and the UK, we borrowed far too much. In fact, adding together the debt of consumers, companies and government, British debt is more than £4 trillion, or 3 times our GDP, the value of everything we produce every year.
We have become, over this last decade, the most indebted nation on earth ever. That's how bad it has got. And, you know, the problem was, globally, obviously you had this great imbalance, huge saving by China, huge borrowing here in the West, but there was nothing in our regulatory system. You know, why is it so much worse in Britain than elsewhere? That there wasn't anything in our regulatory system to call time on the level of borrowing and on the level of debt.
So why didn't the government prevent the creation of this debt bubble?
In the view of everyone who was involved, it was sustainable, that the bubble could be managed, it could be contained without bursting with the rather explosive consequences that we've seen. I think the primary responsibility rests with the banks, but the secondary and very close-run responsibility lies with those whose responsibility it was to supervise the banks and to sound an early warning.
Here's one reason why banks got it wrong. Their bosses didn't understand this stuff, the formulas their rocket scientist traders used for valuing new investment products. But the big reason?
Even though it required a complete suspension of judgment to engage in all of the lending and trading that they did, they took comfort in the fact that their peers were there with them. As a great man once said, no individual lemming ever received bad PR. We only talk about lemmings.
You know, I think it is.
And the reason this is hurting all of us is that banks' losses mean they've had to reduce their lending.
We do see a period in which banks have to reduce the amount of money they borrow, and that will impact the amount they can lend. And I think they're going to have to reduce the amount they borrow quite substantially. So that means roughly 2/3 of the credit at the peak will have gone.
This number, £740 billion, sums up the British banking crisis. It's money that British banks borrowed from money managers, other banks, what's known as wholesale sources of funds, and they've been asked to pay it back. But if they had to do that in one fell swoop, well, they'd collapse, which almost happened in October. So we as taxpayers have stepped in to fill the gap, to the tune of hundreds of billions of pounds of support for our banks. At my feet is the Bank of England, and over there is Parliament, the Treasury and 10 Downing Street. Together, they've pumped mind-boggling amounts of taxpayers' money into the real economy and into the banking system to prevent what looks like a pretty sharp recession turning into something worse, a slump. But when the private sector is dependent on the support and goodwill of taxpayers to that extent, well, that changes everything. And tomorrow, I'll explain why this may lead to a new kind of capitalism. Robert Peston, BBC News.